Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Upstairs Lounge Fire 50 years later. My name is S.C. Lucier, Senior Associate of Public Programs and Partnerships at the American LGBTQ+ Museum. We are delighted to be partnering with the LGBT+ Archives Project of Louisiana to present tonight's program to you. The Archives Project's mission is to promote and encourage the protection and preservation of materials that chronicle the culture and history of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community in Louisiana. They focus on educating the community on the importance of archiving queer historical materials and making them available for future generations to access, research, and study. One of these archival moments that has been chronicled is the devastating story of the Upstairs Lounge fire. In 1973, the deadliest fire in New Orleans history occurred in a small gay bar at 604 Iberville Street in the French Quarter. The Upstairs Lounge was a refuge of love and acceptance in the New Orleans community until, in a matter of only 19 minutes, it became a site of tragedy and rejection. 32 people perished in that fire, and the New Orleans LGBT+ community was changed forever. Before we begin, we'd like to express that some of the details that will be shared tonight might be graphic and disturbing. While we will not be showing explicit photographic documentation of the fire's aftermath, please be aware that this note extends to any exploration of the digital archives you may choose to research following the program. Since we will be discussing a moment in New Orleans queer history, we want to acknowledge that the area now known as Louisiana was once home to many Native peoples, including but not limited to the Choctaw, Ishak, Natchez, Caddo, Chitimacha, Coushatta, Huma, and Tunica Biloxi. We further acknowledge the enduring presence of Native Americans in Louisiana and recognize their contributions to the cultural heritage of the state. Colonial visitors in the Gulf South observed that indigenous nations recognized and respected the existence of more than two genders and conducted marriages between people of the same gender. The legacy of acceptance of LGBTQ+ people has a deep history locally, for which we salute Native American nations. Now I'd like to welcome the multidisciplinary storyteller, Augustus Morgan, who will join us to introduce and contextualize New Orleans and its history. Augustus is guided by the legacy of his people and land. Louisiana-raised, New Orleans-based, with ancestors throughout the places known as the Gulf South, Caribbean, Central America, and Africa. He keeps his people's history and talents alive through the arts and land stewardship. Augustus studies visual, audio, and literary media for liberation with a variety of organizations throughout New Orleans, such as the Black School and Rethink New Orleans. He's also a peer organizer with Trans Queer Youth New Orleans. Please welcome Augustus Morgan.
Thank you, Lucy, for that amazing introduction. Yes, I am speaking from a small section of those multiple peoples that have been brought to New Orleans through coercion and force, but also through love of this place. New Orleans, as we know it, was built on the banks of the Big River or Mississippi, and it has become known by multiple different names in that time. The Ishak knew it as the Big Village, and the Choctaw called it Bobancha, and that was the place of many languages because this place, based on the river delta in connection with all of the Gulf South region and with all of this like wild range of land that could become to this one place, it was a place of trade and exchange and cultural like balance and healing for many indigenous nations throughout this region. And when it was touched by colonization from the French, the Spanish, and the British and Americans, it became still a place of sacred sites, but it introduced a new character, and that was the character of the African peoples who were enslaved and brought to this place. And this is where we have the wide variety of different languages and peoples. And through that coercion, a lot of us died here. So New Orleans, as much as it is a place of sacred intersection, it is also must be recognized as a burial ground for all of the many violences that occurred on this land. But we all know that our traditions live even through this violence, and we have always been ways of remembering the legacy of our people. And that is usually through the arts of music, dance, storytelling, writing, And we try to keep our traditions alive, the legacy alive of all the people who have been lost here, our queer ancestors, our Black and Indigenous ancestors, all of the people who have lost their lives to keep the spirit of New Orleans alive. And I have a few notes of song that I was going to prepare today. My mama told me these stories over cups of cafe au lait. My uncle told me these stories as he prepared for holy days. How every time a mother cries, a funeral song plays through the land. How every time a sister dies, a funeral song plays through the land. But every time we raise our voices, a reunion song plays through the land. So we must remember to dance and speak their names into this land. We must remember our pain and our stories, but we must remember the dance. Thank you. I hope you all keep in mind the people of New Orleans, both here intentionally and through a long history. And remember that all of our stories of those who are here in the past, the present, and the future must rely on us remembering our histories as we do today.
Thank you, Augustus, for that beautiful introduction. Now I would like to welcome our program presenters for the evening, Frank Perez, Robert W. Fieseler, Clayton Delery, and Courtney Sharp. I'll be giving each of them a very brief introduction here, but please visit our program page to learn more about our incredibly accomplished guests. Our moderator and facilitator, Frank Perez, is the co-founder and executive director of LGBT+ Archives Project of Louisiana. He's also a writer, historian, educator, public speaker, small business owner, and tour guide. He's authored several books on New Orleans queer history, the most recent of which is Political Animal: The Life and Times of Stuart Butler. Robert W. Fieseler is a National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association Journalist of the Year and the acclaimed nonfiction author of Tinderbox, winner of the Edgar Award and Louisiana Literary Award, and shortlisted for the Sarowan International Prize for Writing. As a Mellon Fellow at Tulane, Fieseler is presently working on his second queer history book. Clayton Delery is the author of 2 books about the LGBT+ history of New Orleans. The Upstairs Lounge, Arson, which was published in 2014, was named Humanitarian Book of the Year by Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. And 2017's Out for Queer Blood, The Murder of Fernando Rios and the Failure of New Orleans Justice, was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in LGBT nonfiction. Courtney Sharp has been a transgender activist since the mid-1990s. She served on the board of directors for LAGPAC, Mayor Mark Morial's LGBT Advisory Council, and served on the local PFLAG board of directors for 22 years. One of the many key successes resulting from her activism was her advocacy for inclusion for protections of gender identity in the city of New Orleans from 1995 to 98, when the city council passed the ordinance amending Chapter 86 of the Human Relations Code. So a warm welcome to our panelists. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Frank to begin. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy.
Good evening, everyone. I just want to begin by saying thank you for showing an interest in this topic. It is an incredible story and tragedy that is too often not included in the national narratives of queer history. And so I am delighted that you have joined us today to learn a little bit more about it. I'm in a somewhat of a difficult position because I don't know how much you know, if anything at all, about our topic tonight. So I am just going to take just a few moments to go over some really basic points that will hopefully set up and contextualize the rest of our panel discussion. So if we could go to the first slide. All right, let's go to the next one. Okay, what you see here is the picture of a building on the edge of the French Quarter, the historic district in New Orleans. For those of you who are not familiar, the French Quarter was the original city of New Orleans. It's not very big. It's under a square mile, 13 by 6 blocks. And this green building that you're looking at now in 1973 was the home of the upstairs lounge, and specifically the second floor. On the first floor, where you see the red brick, is a bar called Gemini, which was there in 1973 and is still there today. But in 73, the second floor was where the upstairs lounge was located. The entrance to the bar was to the right of the photograph, near where that, I don't know if that's a trash bin or not, but the doorway you see in red on the right is where people would enter. And I think Bobby's going to show us some slides. Robert is going to show us some slides of the stairwell, which played such a prominent role in the fire. So let's go to the next slide. Here's a picture of the regular crowd. It's the only picture we have of the regular crowd, and I'm sure this doesn't include everybody who is a regular, but it does include many of them. And the two things I want to point out in this photograph, if you can see, in the center is a man covering his eyes with his elbow and his forearm. That is Reginald Adams. He is one of the few African-American patrons of the bar. And in the rear, to the left of center, you'll see a woman. That was Betty. And the fact that a Black person and a woman were in a gay bar in 1973 in New Orleans, believe it or not, is kind of amazing, because in the early 1970s, bars in New Orleans were segregated racially, and gay bars were segregated not only racially, but also by orientation. The lesbian bars didn't want men, the gay male bars didn't want women, and so forth and so on. So I think you're going to hear more about Reggie Adams a little bit later, and some of the other people pictured here. In the foreground, you'll see posing with his hand on his hip is Mike Scarborough. And Mike Scarborough was at the bar the night of the fire and actually had a physical altercation with the alleged arsonist, which I'm sure you'll hear about a little bit later on. So let's go to the next slide. So June 24th, 1973 was a Sunday. And on Sundays, the upstairs lounge had a beer bust. And without going into great detail, because I don't want to steal the other panelists' thunder, one of the regulars, who was not very well liked, got into a fight with Mike Scarborough and was creating some other problems because he was really belligerent and obnoxiously drunk. He was expelled from the bar, got angry, and came back and set it on fire. And so the very next morning, this was the headline in the New Orleans paper, the Times-Picayune: 29 killed in quarter blaze. And that number would actually grow because 3 more died in the hospital in the subsequent days. There were a total of 15 people injured, and several others escaped. And the image you see on the left of the paper is the horrified face of Rusty Quinton, who was not only a regular, but an employee, a part-time employee of the bar, looking up in the aftermath of that tragedy. So let's go to the next slide. For those who are interested in digging a little deeper, there have been 3 books and 3 films written about the fire. And I don't know if I'm going to hold these books up, if you can see them or not, but Johnny Townsend's book, Inferno in the French Quarter, is an amazing chronicle of the lives of the victims who died, as well as some other relevant facts. There was also Clayton Delery's book, The Upstairs Lounge, which is an amazing, almost minute by minute narrative of the happenings that day, and just a great account of what actually happened. And then there's Robert Fieseler's book, Tinderbox, which expands and builds upon Johnny Townsend and Clay Delery's research, and then goes a little step further in that it contextualizes the tragedy of the Upstairs Lounge in a national context. So those are three amazing books that anybody interested in queer history should read. There have also been 3 documentary films. The Upstairs Lounge Fire was the very first one. It's a short film that came out in 2013. That was followed up in 2015 with a full feature-length documentary called Upstairs Inferno. And then a few years after that, in 2018, Prejudice and Pride was produced by the ABC documentary news team. And I believe Prejudice and Pride is available on YouTube for anybody who is looking for it. So we have been very fortunate in the last 10 years. There's been a lot more interest and research done on the fire. And for anybody who wants to learn more, I would encourage you to visit the web address that's listed there, the LGBT Archives, Louisiana.org. That is the Archives Project of Louisiana's website. We have a special page devoted to the Upstairs Lounge Fire, where you will find a lot of pictures, news story links, video from our 50th commemoration recently, and a lot of other information. So I hope that kind of sets up our discussion tonight. And at this point, I want to turn it over to Robert Fieseler.
Hi, team. This is me, Bobby Fieseler. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, I'm presuming yes. If we could go to the next set of slides. So I'm going to provide a little bit of context for the society that created the conditions for the tragedy of the Upstairs Lounge. So the Upstairs Lounge fire is this multi-layered tragic event, right? It's this notoriously unsolved arson fire that took place at a gay bar in 1973 in New Orleans, and it claimed 32 lives. It's the deadliest fire on record in New Orleans history, the worst mass killing of queer folk in U.S. history in the 20th century. And yet it received just a few days of media attention in its time due to rampant anti-gay bigotry. Despite a bounty of evidence, as Frank pointed out, pointing towards a chief suspect, an internally conflicted gay for pay hustler, a sex worker named Roger Dale Nunez, this massacre, this crime was deemed in its day a political inconvenience due to the queer overtones, and thus permitted to become the historic mystery that it's considered now. The Upstairs Lounge, absurdly, is still considered an unsolved crime by the New Orleans Police Department. And so I'm going to explore the layers to the tragedy. So there's kind of 3 layers to it. One is there was a group of queer folk in a queer haven that existed in a society with an innate characteristics that they could not rid of themselves. And so they were asked by that society to live semi-invisibly, in hiding, discreetly. In other words, in a kind of social compact where there was a sort of plausible deniability. That's the first tragedy. The second is those already invisible individuals were then murdered in an intentionally set fire. And the third aspect of the tragedy is then all word of those individuals and memory of them were wiped away from the slate of history, except by a few persistent voices who then raised and revived the memory of the fire in the 21st century, which I'm sure Clayton and Courtney are going to get into. So the context for the fire, right? The society that asked the individuals to live semi-invisibly, the context of the Upstairs Lounge. Next slide, please. So I wrote the book Tinderbox about the Upstairs Lounge. I was also the queer public scholar that worked with the New Orleans City Council in 2022 to pass an apology resolution to acknowledge the city's ghastly response to the Upstairs Lounge tragedy in addition to historic queer discrimination, and also to posthumously recognize and honor the Upstairs Lounge victims who were worthy, who lived interesting lives. And I want to talk a little bit about the physical geography and the human geography of their very, very interesting lives. These were all people who were worthy of a book, worthy of a film, even if some, the worst and most tragic thing had not happened to them. So next slide, please. So Frank hit on this a little bit earlier. The Upstairs Lounge was located on almost like a castle keep in an oasis space on the second story of a building that seems, right now, this is a modern picture of the Upstairs Lounge building, the green building. They were located on the second floor. The first floor was a straight bar visible in street view. The second floor was where they hid the queer space. It was a cavernous space, right, that had to be up and away from the street. And a lot of people that passed by it on their way to errands had no idea that there was a gay bar of the size of the Upstairs Lounge upstairs. And the third floor of that building was actually a flop house for longshoremen and various wage-earning folk that worked in the French Quarter. So to get into the Upstairs Lounge bar, you would have to access it by a side door on a seedy street called Iberville. And this side door was so innocuous. Okay, next slide, please. So, okay, you would walk by this awning that just said upstairs. All right. So it's like, it was almost designed to be uninteresting. You'd have to think about it like this. They named the bar Upstairs because literally the bar was located on the second story of a bar, but it's not like you walked by the signage and it said like spread eagle, or it doesn't say like cock. It doesn't say anything like that, right? Like as opposed to if you walked on Bourbon Street, right, you would see a lot more titillating, flashing fluorescent signage in the 1970s. You'd see some interesting stuff. This was a bar that just said blankly upstairs. Okay, so this was a bar accessed by queer folk in the know about a secret society that would be happening, that would be existing if only they climbed up can we go to the next slide? A twisting staircase, right? Where even that what was happening at the end of the staircase, what was not visible from the bottom of the staircase. So such that even if let's say straight tourists were looking up the staircase, they wouldn't be entranced or even be tempted to walk up the stairs to see what was going on upstairs. But if you were in the know, you would walk up this twisting staircase, which in the 1970s was cloaked in cloth. And walking up these stairs, these 13 wooden stairs, would be a lot like entering a portal for you, right? You'd be heading up, and away from the world that oppressed you down in the street below and into your favorite, can we get the next slide, please? Your favorite social club, okay? And Frank hinted on this too. This is the only extant photograph of the Upstairs Lounge regulars together. And I love showing this photograph because it shows the character of the bar. The Upstairs Lounge was a working class gay bar. It did have a few members, right, of some elite professions, but it would only be dentists, gay dentists, etc. This would be wage earning folk, people that were not out at their jobs, out at work, people who risked much, right, to enter a queer space in this time, and people who would be checking over their shoulders to make sure that they hadn't been followed by a neighbor or by a coworker or that who'd overseen them walking up the staircase as they accessed this spot. And I look at this photograph a lot. Frank referenced the gentleman in the lower left-hand corner, Michael Scarborough, holding his drink. And I like to think it's kind of like a Sazerac cocktail, which is the official cocktail of New Orleans. And the rule with those is one's not enough, two's too many, three's just right. So it's just like a boisterous queer society. And I want to point out a couple people in this photograph. Frank pointed out that there's Reggie Adams hiding his face. There's also an individual that's putting a cigarette to his mouth. Next slide, please. That individual is Reverend Bill Larson. So this was the pastor of the local gay church, the Metropolitan Community Church that met inside the Upstairs Lounge space. And Bill Larson served a very valuable religious need to the queer folk that attended and lived the Upstairs Lounge atmosphere and partook in this environment that was really it was so egalitarian, it was really a forerunner to many modern queer safe havens. So you'd have a queer minister as part of the environment, and he would perform any range of services in that community clearinghouse atmosphere. And you also had, next slide, please, Reginald Adams. This was a guy that drank regularly at the Upstairs Lounge. He's African-American, and he is also a Jesuit novice. who is about to leave his religious order because he falls in love he finds a partner who's now come to identify as trans, named Regina, and they fall in love at the upstairs lounge. And what's rare in New Orleans society is they're an interracial couple. They also cross gender, they cross class, they cross religion, they cross all sorts of things, and they meet and court and are celebrated within the upstairs lounge atmosphere. So this is Reginald Adams, a guy that shakes off the shackles of the priesthood in the upstairs lounge context. So you see a little bit about like how religious crossroads and also religious liberation happens within the upstairs lounge. Next slide, please. All right, you also see this is, if you walked into the front bar area, this is a little bit of the atmosphere of the upstairs lounge. Red flocked wallpaper that had been cleaned with petroleum distillate. There's a photograph of Burt Reynolds lying, naked on a bearskin rug. There's a photograph behind the individual that kind of is dressed up in a Halloween outfit. And the photograph is Mark Spitz, the Olympic swimmer, smiling like this with his gold medals dangling over his star-spangled Speedo. And the reason I bring this up is because you see in this atmosphere that all of that stuff in the background there, that was not up to code. The upstairs lounge existed in a corrupt criminal atmosphere too, where owners could bribe city inspectors so as not to be inspected for fire code. And so you see a lot of fire hazards in the upstairs lounge environment too, even in aspects that seem charming. Next slide, please. So this is the national atmosphere for how Americans felt about queer life and homosexuality. And that was something that oppressed the individuals down at street level before they entered into the queer atmosphere. 70% of Americans in 1973 defined homosexuality as always wrong. Next slide. But also within New Orleans, you have to understand there's this context of individuals who are defining homosexuality as always wrong. And yet in New Orleans, you have this teeming underworld atmosphere of tons and tons of gay bars in and around the French Quarter, more than 25. This is the 1974 referencing the 73 bars of the Bob Dameron address book, or the Gay Green Book, in other words, for all major American cities. And the upstairs lounge is there, and it's referenced as a dive. And then there's a little bit of a asterisk there, and that signifies it was very, very popular. Next slide, please. But also it occurs within this environment of police corruption and political corruption, right? And any queer folk can be arrested for any range of queer crimes. So this is an example of how gay men and women could be arrested for just dancing or in a close embrace or holding hands or occupying space on a sidewalk or any amount of pressure. And then if you're arrested, unfortunately, in this atmosphere, your arrest would then be publicized in the local newspaper and you would be blacklisted to the society you loved, because everyone would then know the truth about you in an environment where you were only allowed to live euphemistically. Next slide. But the upstairs lounge also, it was an egalitarian space that had a lot of, not a lot of, but that did embrace all races. And yet there was a racial dynamic in New Orleans, because this was the South, where gay bars, as hypocritical as it might sound, were segregated. In fact, so down the street from the upstairs lounge, which was its own second story bar, there was I give this example, there was another secret second story gay bar for Black gay folk called the Safari Lounge. And this is a bar that Reginald Adams and Regina would also go to. And after the fire at the upstairs lounge, which led to the destruction of that one unique queer space, the Safari Lounge was surreptitiously closed without explanation by city authorities. So one fire at one gay bar at the upstairs lounge led to the disappearance of actually two queer spaces, the upstairs lounge and the Safari Lounge, on the same street in the same year. Next slide, please. And that's the context for what the upstairs lounge crowd and a little bit of the oppression that they had to deal with, and the amount of bravery they would have to show every time that they mustered up the courage to take the bus or drive to the French Quarter and then walk up those 13 stairs to access the queer space where they found people that loved and embraced them, a true community. Almost like a gay working class kind of cheers, where everybody was literally welcome, and people would shout and clap when your friends walked into the room. And in the upstairs lounge tragedy, sadly, many of the couples that met and kindled romances at the upstairs lounge would be challenged, separated, etc. Next slide. Someone would survive together. This is upstairs lounge survivors Alfred Doolittle and Stuart Butler, and some of the couples would very sadly be ripped asunder. Either one would survive and the other did not in the calamity of the fire, or some couples died together in the blaze themselves. And I think of the upstairs lounge as a place of love, and as a place that made love possible for many people. And so I think this is a dynamic that I sometimes reflect on and pause on. So I think of in terms of not just who survived and who died, but how did it affect the loving relationships of that unique place? And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Frank, and he'll hand it over to Clayton.
Okay, thank you, Bobby. Very insightful, thank you. As horrific as the fire was, equally horrific was the reaction to the fire on the part of the city and the government. And to talk about the aftermath, we have author Clay Delery. So Clay, tell us a little bit about the aftermath.
All right, thank you. And thank all of you for being here tonight, whether you're another participant or whether you're listening. It's been mentioned a couple of times that the upstairs lounge fire was the deadliest fire in recorded New Orleans history, and it still holds that distinction. And so one of the questions, one of the natural questions is, how did the city react to this horrible calamity? And in order to highlight the reaction, I'm going to talk about two other fires that happened within the preceding year. One was at an office building called the Ralt Center, and it was a multi-story office building. And a fire started in one of the middle floors, and it started traveling upwards. And what that meant was that some people on the upper floors were trapped. There were a number of people who leapt off of the building down to the roof of a parking garage 6 floors below, and incredibly, a couple of those people survived. There was a total of 6 deaths with the Ralt fire. And then just a couple of months later, there was an arson sniping incident at a Howard Johnson's hotel, which was just a block or so away. And the arsonist lit the fire, and then as people tried to escape, he was shooting at them. And in particular, he was shooting at police and firefighters who were trying to assist in rescue and recovery. They were both horrible incidents. And after each of those incidents, the mayor of the city of New Orleans granted many television interviews and many newspaper interviews. He called for citywide days of mourning. He established relief funds. The governor of the state of Louisiana weighed in. He was doing many of the same things. The Archbishop of New Orleans, and New Orleans is such a heavily Catholic city that the Archbishop becomes kind of a quasi-pope locally. He too was in front of the television cameras, and he too was granting multiple interviews to newspapers. He said the funeral mass for some of the policemen and firefighters who died in the Howard Johnson's incident. When that was still going on, he offered himself as a volunteer hostage in case the arsonist was holding other people. So all three of these leaders, one from the state level, one from the city level, and one from the spiritual community, were making every effort to let the people of New Orleans know that horrible things were happening and that these people deserve sympathy and aid and medical assistance. And then a few months later, the fire at the upstairs lounge happened. And it's worth pointing out that the final death toll of the upstairs lounge fire is double that of the Ralt Center and the Howard Johnson's fires combined. So what did we hear from the mayor? Not a thing. He was out of town at the time, but he was in touch with his office. Neither he nor his office would release any kind of statement. The governor refused to come to the phone, despite multiple calls for a statement of some kind. The Archbishop refused to come to the phone and refused to issue any kind of statement, either to the press or or through his office. And needless to say, none of these men appeared on camera, although they all had for the prior two incidents. So in the absence of what should have been leadership, there was this vacuum where the people who should have been making statements were not. And that meant that the people who normally wouldn't have been making statements had an opportunity. And so one of the few public statements about the upstairs lounge fire that came from anyone connected with the city came from a member of the police department who basically blamed the victims. He said to the newspapers, well, you know, some thieves hung out there and it was a queer bomb. The implication being, who cares? There's no sympathy. He also made the statement that it would be difficult to identify some of the victims because homosexuals were known to carry false identification. And there is absolutely no evidence that any of the people who died in the fire were carrying false identification. There was a local radio DJ. He was kind of an early version of Rush Limbaugh or Howard Stern. He was kind of a proto shock jock. He was making jokes on the air like, how do you bury 32 gay people who died in a fire? You put them in fruit jars. Jokes were circulating around the city like, what do you call 32 gay dead men? Crispy critters. And it was a horrible time. Some of the people who were actually in the bar and survived, or who had friends who died, went to work the next day. Because the force of the closet at that time was so strong that they certainly couldn't admit to their coworkers that they went to that bar, or they had friends that did. It was being fired or certainly being ostracized. And there was no one to take up for the victims or for the people who had been in the fire and survived. So fortunately, into this gap stepped the Reverend Troy Perry, founder of the Metropolitan Community Church, which was the first gay affirming ministry in the United States. And it started off very small, 12 people in Troy Perry's living room. And today it has branches all over the world. He was accompanied by some of his ministers and by two gay activists, Morty Manford from New York City and Morris Kite from LA. And they came to the city and they dared to go to the television news stations and to seek out television journalists and to speak on camera with their faces shown. And this was unknown. Gay people in New Orleans had not done this before. And they were trying to raise awareness, and they were trying to organize efforts. One thing they did, which was crucially important in the short term, was that they organized a memorial service for the victims that took place a week after the fire in a church, St. Mark's Methodist Church on the edge of the French border. They had a very difficult time finding a church that would accept them. The Archbishop had given orders that none of the upstairs victims were to be allowed Catholic burial. He made it very clear that there would be no memorial services for them in a Catholic church. Some of the ministers and parishes and congregations that Reverend Perry and the other activists called would laugh at them over the phone. This one Methodist church did step up. And people went, even though they were afraid to. They were afraid it might be attacked like the upstairs lounge had been. They were also afraid that there would be journalists there filming things and that they would be caught on camera. And so the organizers of the memorial specifically asked the television news cameras, the news crews, not to come to the memorial. The church was packed. Some people were survivors, some people had lost friends, some were there just out of a sense of solidarity. They were all in pain, they were all afraid. And then toward the end of the service, word got out that there was, in fact, a television news camera outside and that people might be filmed leaving. And again, because of the power of the closet, this would have been much more frightening. This would have been really frightening to the people in the church. So Reverend Perry announced that there was a side door that people could choose to leave through if they were afraid of being on camera. And some people were considering that, but then a woman stood up, and she's believed to be Alice Brady, who owns several lesbian bars in the city. And she stood up and she said, "I'm not ashamed of who I am, and I'm not ashamed of who my friends are. I came in the front door. I'm going out that way." And so as the recessional began, she followed the ministers conducting the service, and then everyone in the church followed her, and they went out to face the cameras. And this is sometimes seen as being the defining moment in starting an active gay liberation movement in New Orleans. One other thing I'd like to mention, if I'm not running short of time, is that Reverend Perry and the other activists didn't stop their aid at the end of that week. And they did something that was crucially important. They started what was called the National New Orleans Memorial Fund. They teamed up with the Advocate, which then as now was one of the leading gay publications in the United States. And they raised funds from throughout the country. And some of these funds helped pay hospital bills for survivors. Some of them reimbursed burial costs for the dead. Some of them allowed survivors who had been severely injured to have some sort of income until they were ready to go back to work. But this was the first time that the queer community in the United States organized on a national scale to help each other. And that was crucially important at the time of the fire. But it was also important less than a decade later when this strange new disease started taking out primarily gay men. And city officials and religious officials and national officials were doing precious little to give any kind of aid or support. When AIDS came along, activists were able to organize because they had done it before and the framework was in place and they knew what to do. And that is one of the lasting legacies of the Upstairs Lounge. And that's it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Courtney. But again, thank you all for letting me be here.
Thank you, Clay. We're going to now hear from Courtney Sharp, who is going to talk a little bit about the legacy of the fire. And so, Courtney, feel free to take it away.
Okay, first slide. So what I'm going to focus on tonight is the comparing what did we learn from the response to the Upstairs Lounge fire in our community? How did our community take this lesson and incorporate it into the work that we're doing today? We'll look at what is the current political and social landscape and compare it to what it was in the 1970s. And then I'm going to focus quickly on a really important case, the Plessy versus Ferguson case from the 1890s. It's a Supreme Court decision in 1896, and it has a lot to do with how we view a person's right to define themselves, and how that affects when the state is the one that defines who we are and what we can be. So as I go through this, the backdrop is this year we're in the South. The GOP political machines throughout the South were promoting anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ legislation heavily. And they were focused on primarily affirming medical care for trans youth. That was a huge one. There was a bill to prevent and ban anyone within the school systems to use somebody's pronouns that didn't agree with their gender at birth. And then there was the Don't Say Gay bill that prevented any discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in grades K through 12. So that was going on this year. And we'll go to the next slide and we'll take a look at nationwide. What was the social climate based on the policies that were existing in the state? So the first slide here is a look at the overall policy for the LGBT community as a whole. And you can see throughout the South, they had a very negative policy throughout the negative policy. And the dark green is a high overall policy. So overall, it was 30% negative. 30% of the adults in the US lived in a state with negative policy, and 43% of adults lived in a state with high ratings. We'll go to the next slide. Now we're going to break it down and take a separate look at what's it look like if we look at sexual orientation separate from gender identity, and then we'll come back and look at gender identity. So here you can see throughout the South, you have 3 states that are very negative, and then the others are low. And then you have the states that are high are usually on the coast, either coast in Colorado, New Mexico, Minnesota, Illinois. So, but it's usually, it goes along with what we see trend-wise. The coast are generally very accepting and the South is not. Now take a look at that, because the next slide is going to show for gender identity, and that the scheme changes a lot. And you can see that throughout the South and the mountain states and whatnot, that you have a very negative view, very negative policies about trans and the trans and gender non-conforming people. So in that one, it's like the negative is 34% of the adults are living in a very negative state, and 45% are in a high state. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage for you're not going to find a very accommodating climate in much of the states with the red area, and that's what we find here in Louisiana. The next slide. Okay, what did our students do? So as I said, there were oppressive bills being promoted in the legislature. This is a picture of our students from Ben Franklin High School in New Orleans who organized a walkout for their school. And they were energized, organized, and very young as far as activists are concerned, but they weren't going to let this go by without them having a voice in it. And there's a difference. These students are Gen Z, so they are very active politically and they care about what's going on. So the next slide, that was at their school. We'll go to the next slide. So after the school, and they continued their rally at Washington's Park, which is outside of the French Quarter. And also we're organizing a march throughout the French Quarter. So this is where they were gathering and had a few speakers at the beginning as they were forming, just before they were forming to have their march. And they had a lot of people there in attendance. So the next slide is a throwback. And the way I see it is the atmosphere is pretty much like it was in 1977 when Anita Bryant, who was a very popular singer across, organized a protest against a non-discrimination ordinance in Miami-Dade County, Florida. And that she premised it on Save Our Children. So that was their marching orders, was their mantra was to always, within her thing, was to save our children, prevent gay teachers from teaching in the schools. And the gay community in the late 1970s organized and protested wherever she would show up as a performer. So she came to New Orleans in 1977, and the New Orleans contingency, it's one of the biggest rallies, protests that took place in New Orleans, and was mentioned as one of the very first active public stance from the community. See the next slide. The next slide. Okay, you would ask, it's like, do the protest help, and do they help further the public opinion in an area where they're having protest? And here's Clancy Dubois. He wrote an article, an editorial. It turned out it was This Week in Gambit, and he heard the students. And this past week, the Louisiana legislature called themselves back for an override session because the Democratic governor had vetoed the ban on medical care for trans youth bill, and the legislature called themselves back to pass it. So they came back for one day, passed it, and Clancy has always been supportive of the trans community and the LGBT community in all of his writings. But he took a look this week and said it's not going to end anytime soon. And it's just like a wildfire that's going across the nation and in the South. The next slide. Okay, a lot of people don't know. It's like, how did all of this start with the focus for the GOP strategist to select trans youth as the focus of so much anti-legislation? And this man is Terry Schilling. He's the president of American Principles Project, and he's a strategist for them. He was working on the governor's campaign in Kentucky in 2020, and he was doing some polling and doing some focus groups, and he started asking questions about, what about the trans youth and the participation in sports? And he recognized that every time he framed the question as, what are your thoughts about biological males participating in women's activities, that it went sky high and people would get upset. So he was promoting at that point that the GOP governor candidate go ahead and start using it. So as a test, they flooded the media market with anti-trans media advertising in Kentucky towards the end of the campaign. And he noticed that the results were that plenty of the independent voters did lean towards, so they to the Republican candidate, but still it wasn't enough. It wasn't organized enough. So the Democratic governor still won. But based on that, he said, he started promoting it and saying, hey, we could utilize this strategy across the nation. And then you started seeing this legislation take up in all the legislatures across the South where they had GOP control. So it's Terry Schilling is the man, and there's a lot of literature out there. It's kind of hidden, but he was open about what he was doing, and it's pretty well documented. So the next slide. Okay, this one is of very particular interest to me, and it's something about the culture in New Orleans and the legal situation and how that might apply to the current situation. And we had Homer Plessy. There was a Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. It was Homer Plessy. He was a person of, he was 7/8 white, 1/8 black. So the state had passed a separate car act for the railroads that that segregated the people who were riding on the trains into separate cars. So this was a very organized attempt to challenge this law, and he was recruited and offered himself up, and he had attorneys, and they wanted to come up with a case. So he went on the train and sat down, and the conductors asked him what his race was. According to the law, he was African-American black, and he refused to take a seat, so they arrested him and charged him for violation of the Separate Car Act. Well, that went further, and it was a way for them to challenge it. But the railroads in Louisiana were also in favor of them going ahead and pressing this case. The conductors were there, the police officers were all participating. So it was like almost like a planned action to take place so that they could bring a certain case forward into the Louisiana. So that case did not pass, and the case was a very negative case and resulted in the Jim Crow laws for many years across the South. But when you look at it, you tear it apart and you look at that case and what was it essentially taking place. It was the Supreme Court upheld the state power to say who's who, and it treated the court's Plessy decision and the decision's legacy as implicating more than race and denying individual autonomy to determine personal identity, given that the ruling sanctions state imposition of embedded social prejudices and practices to deny Plessy, and by extension, all others, any right of self-identity without state determination. And when you look at it, that's exactly the case that's happening with the LGBT community across the South and across the country. It's like, who gets to decide who they are and what their identity is, and then the states are trying to control that. So it's a very good case to look at. There's a very good law review article on it, if anybody's interested, and we can get that information to you.
Thank you, Courtney. I'm assuming our host from New York have something to say.
Thanks, Frank. This is a moment for any audience members who have questions to please note them in the chat. You'll also see at the bottom of your bar, your Zoom bar, there is a feature called Q&A, and it has two little text bubbles overlapped on top of each other. So if you have a question, please drop that into the chat or drop that directly into the Q&A feature. I don't see any questions right now, so we can always invite you to reach out to us, reach out to the LGBT Archives Project of Louisiana, or reach out to the American LGBTQ+ Museum. Let us know that you attended this program and that you have a question that you were not able to ask us during the program, but that you would very much like answered, and we're happy to get back to you. Also, this recording will be available online with captions, and so we will be uploading this to our YouTube page, and so this is evergreen, you know, content, and you can return to this or share it with other folks who were not able to be here at this time. So I just want to say another thank you. My name is Suhaili Bautista Carolina. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Partnerships at the American LGBTQ+ Museum, which will open its doors in New York City in 2026. So I hope you'll come visit us. I just want to say thank you to all of our attendees and participants for being with us this evening for Upstairs Lounge Fire 50 Years Later, a partnership program between the American LGBTQ+ Museum and the LGBT+ Archives Project of Louisiana. I also want to express our deepest gratitude to our panelists, Courtney Sharp, Clayton Delery, Robert Fieseler, and our moderator, Frank Perez. Another thank you to Augustus Morgan for our opening song. And again, thank you to all of you for spending your time with us this evening. We hope you'll join us for a future public program. Follow us on social media, sign up for our newsletter to know what is coming up, and become a founding member of the museum. And thank you so much again for being with us this evening. I'll throw it over to Frank for any closing words.
Thank you, Suhaili. I would just want to thank everybody for taking the time to learn about this really important event. And if you want to learn more, just reach out to us, visit our website. We're happy to answer your questions or enter into dialogues and conversations with you. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. Thanks for joining us.